Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome on this second webinar in 2 weeks' time on European values. My name is Stijn Latré. I'm the director of UXIA, the University Center St. Ignatius, Antwerp, and we are organizing this series of lectures together with the European Values Chair. The holder of this chair is Professor Hélène Touquet. I was your host last week on the issue of migration and Europe. Tonight, the session will be hosted by Professor Touquet. She will further introduce you to the speakers of tonight, whom I welcome, of course, especially Professor Peter Verovšek and the rector of our University of Antwerp, Professor Herman Van Goethem. Special welcome to you and especially to the rector in these very busy Corona times that you could make time for us and to be with us tonight. So thank you very much for that. Before I give the floor to Hélène, I simply run through some practical issues, technical issues. If I can get the slide again, the opening slide, then I can run through these practical details. I can start by saying that I'm trying to open the slides again. This session will be recorded, of course. So that's for your privacy. This also means that you can watch the video again afterwards in case you might want to review a certain passage. If you experience any technical problems, please first make sure that you use Google Chrome as your browser and in the last version, latest update. If technical problems will persist, you can contact moderator Marijke Selis, whom I thank very much for being our technical moderator tonight. In the right-hand corner, you can find a menu which you can unfold, and there you find the settings wheel. There you can adjust notification settings, so pop-up notifications, you can disable or enable them. So, and then, of course, an important aspect of this webinar is also the interaction with the audience. So you're kindly invited to ask your questions to either the keynote speaker or the respondent, Professor Van Goethem, via the chat function. Chat to everyone. There you can post your questions, but please keep it to the content of the webinar itself, so no personal messages and so on, just questions about the content of what you hear tonight. So I wish you all a very good session. I now grant the floor to Professor Touquet. Very good webinar for all of you.
Thank you. Stijn, for that introduction. I'm sorry I seem to have disappeared for a second there. I don't know what went on. I hope that doesn't occur again. So I am indeed the holder of the chair in European values, and the goal of the chair in European values is to stimulate debate and reflection on the meaning of European values and the usages of European values. And in that sense, this seminar is one of our main, or this series of seminars is one of the main things that we're trying to organize to stimulate debate and reflection. And tonight we will be talking about the meaning of the memory of the Second World War for the European Union and Europe as a whole. We're welcoming Professor Peter Verovšek, who has recently written a book on the topic. And one of the fascinating aspects of that book is how he discusses the generational divides within the European Union. As you know, the Holocaust was one of the foundational myths of the European Union. And this has changed over the past 15 years, especially since 2004, when the Eastern European states succeeded and began to lay more emphasis on their recollection of the memory of communism. So we've seen a shift from the memory of the Holocaust and Nazism to anti-totalitarianism more broadly. And this has some profound effects, which Peter will also discuss. So Peter will talk for 45 minutes approximately. And then we will invite a response of our rector, Professor Van Goethem, who is also a specialist in the Second World War especially in Belgium. He is the one of the people who established the Caserne d'Ossat, the Holocaust Memorial in Mechelen, and has also recently written the book 1942, which is about the Holocaust in Antwerp. So I don't want to speak much longer. The only thing that I also want to announce is that I've recently edited a short volume on European values. This volume consists of 3 interviews with, among others, Peter Verovšek, also with Cynthia Miller-Idris and François Forêt. So these are the 3 people that were the speakers in the first series of lectures, and we discussed all sorts of interesting topics, such as the impact of the pandemic on Europe, Corona nationalism. We also talked about the generational divides, about the rise of the far right and right-wing extremism in Europe, comparing this a little bit to the US. So if you would like to know more about this volume, go to the website of ASP Publishers, where you can order the book, or you can always email me for if you would like more information. And we will be doing these volumes for every series of lectures. So also for the upcoming talks on LGBTI rights and on the grassroots feminist activism of Black women, which is one of our following lectures. But I would like now to give the floor to Peter Verovšek. Peter, are you there? Have you turned on your camera?
I have.
Yeah, there you are. So I'll, without further ado, we'll give you the floor.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Helen. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you also to Barbara and to Uxia for organizing all of this, to Rector Professor Van Goethem for coming as well and for agreeing to give a response, which I very much look forward to, and to all of the rest of you for coming. Today I'm going to address the topic of European values by basically talking about the book that I recently published called Memory and the Future of Europe. It just came out this summer with Manchester University Press. And in the book, I really explore how memories, particularly of the Second World War, but more generally of Europe's age of total war, basically from 1914 to 1945, really served as kind of a motivational, justificatory, and even cognitive resource for certain changes in post-war Europe. And then towards the end, I also think about or reflect on what changes in generations and in general the passing of time means for the kinds of European values that were inaugurated sort of in the post-war era coming out of these memories, and what the loss of that memory really means for Europe in the present and for Europe's future. So let me see my slides up. Okay, second. There we go. Okay, so this is the cover of the book, Memory of the Future of Europe. And today I'm going to try to very briefly, so hopefully in 35 minutes, not more than 40, run you through the basic structure of the argument. So first, I'm going to just provide a little bit of background on the paradigm of collective memory, how I'm using memory, what effects it had on Europe, and how it led to the foundation of Europe. And then I want to run you through my kind of generational argument. And then finally, I want to sort of reflect on recent challenges to the Europe that emerges out of the Second World War. And in particular, I'm going to highlight 2 main challenges. The first is the challenge of changing generations. We're currently, Europe is currently under the leadership of the first generation of leaders who were born after 1945 and thus have no memories of the war and are not affected by them in the same way. And also that I'm going to talk a little bit about what the different memory culture, different memory regime of the new post-communist member states means for Europe as well. So to say a little bit about the paradigm of collective memory. So in my book, I examine the EU's past in order to understand both its present and its possible futures. And the idea here is that politics and our experiences in the past often affect the way we think about the present. They affect politics in the present. It's notable to me that if you pick up almost any history of Europe or of European integration, whether it's Ernie Haas, whether it's Andrew Verovšek, or pretty much anybody else, in the first couple of pages, almost everyone will talk about the context of the post-war era and the initial post-war years. But then inevitably they'll say, oh, but the true causes of unification are the rescue of the nation state, or are sort of economic effects of spillover. So everybody recognizes the effects of memory, but nobody really talks about them. And I really, in my work, wanted to take the idea of memory serious and really consider what it means to think about memory as a cause, or memory as something that affects politics in the present. So in contrast to those existing studies that really focus on these kind of economic, social, and political factors, my book is kind of part of a broader literature, along with people like Kathleen McNamara, that really tries to look at culture. It tries to really take culture seriously. And culture just in the sense of how participants perceive these other factors, and how those perceptions are shaped by various elements in their surroundings. And those surroundings, of course, also include the past. They include memories, they include this kind of lived experience and kind of stories that get told in the aftermath of important events that occur, and that really then shape culture in important ways. So my book in this sense is part of what David Blight has described memory boom. That sort of, had an initial wave starting in the 1980s, but it really has picked up sort of after the year 2000. And it's sort of part of a new wave of scholarship on memory at the EU, along with some volumes by Catherine Guessai and Aline Sierp. So let me say a little bit about memory and historical ruptures. So most of the time, collective memories, the kinds of recollections and the way we build our past, in some cases even through mythical understandings, most of the time collective memory acts as a stabilizing force. Right? This idea of, if you look even at kind of common law traditions, the idea of the way we have done things since time out of mind, right? The idea of tradition is an important part of our kind of collective memory. And most of the time, sort of these kind of ideas of the past shaping the present are a stabilizing force, right? Whether that's for old monarchies, for things like parliament and parliamentary sovereignty in the UK. Most of the time, collective memory regimes, this kind of way we've always done things, form traditions, and they stabilize politics. So they help to mitigate against change. But every now and then, there are events that sort of destabilize those existing narratives, sort of delegitimize them. And I call these moments kind of ruptures. And in doing so, I'm drawing my inspiration from the Frankfurt School social and literary theorist Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin talks about ruptures. In German, it's Bruch. He talks about these kind of ruptures that make the continuum of history explode. Right? These kind of ruptures that delegitimize the narratives that we've told ourselves in the past, and that force us to sort of come up with new narratives. And my argument is based on the idea that Europe's age of total war, this period from the First World War to the Second World War, which includes the interwar crisis, the Great Depression, and all of those events, right? The rise of fascism, that period really acts as this kind of rupture that gradually chips away at the kind of standard narrative of nationalism that had been established in the middle of the 19th century in Europe, and that sort of chips away at the legitimacy of ideas that nationalism is a way to peace, that nationalism is a way of harmony, that nationalism is a way to democracy. Right? I mean, if we think about people like Mazzini, or these kind of other theorists of nationalism that see it as a positive force, right? That once every nation has a state, there will be peace. Over the course of the interwar crisis, that narrative is chipped away at. After World War I, during the peace treaties, there's the attempt to sort of do nationalism better, right? To better align nations and states in order to provide peace. The Second World War and the interwar crisis sort of do away with that narrative. Right? And they sort of create what Sheila Ben-Habib has described as a gap between the past and the future of such magnitude that the past, while still present, is fragmented. Right? So in this sense, after these kind of ruptures, societies, and in particular political leaders, are able to sort of take the past and tell new stories about it. They're able to take this fragmented past and reconstruct it into new narratives. And that's kind of what I argue is what's happening in the first years of post-war Europe. The fragmented past, right, out of that delegitimized narrative of nationalism, that past fragments, and individual leaders, states, and even movements like the European movement are able to recombine that past to tell a new story, to legitimize new political regimes, new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking. And in particular, it's a new way of connecting what Reinhard Koselleck calls the space of experience to our horizons of expectation. Right? So the past links to our present, and in thinking about the past in our present, we imagine different futures. And in imagining that different future, that affects the way we take action today. So as Helene already said, my argument is really sort of based around this kind of narrative I tell about changing generations and how different generational cohorts relate to the past. And so in telling my story very briefly to you today, I'm going to focus on the four basic cohorts that I think are particularly important. And just as a kind of shorthand, I call these the founders, the builders, the skeptics, and the Europeans. And with the Europeans, that's where I'm going to hopefully end my talk on a bit of a note of optimism, or at least provide some hope for the future. So to set the stage a little bit, in terms of what was happening in the immediate post-war years, I think it's important to realize that the generation of leaders that took power after World War II lived through the war, so World War II, as well as the whole period of Europe's age of total war as adults. Right? They were all born at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and were fully formed adults. And they experienced the delegitimation of those initial narratives of nationalism firsthand, so as fully formed individuals. Many of the people that took power after the war, not all, were active members of the resistance. And in the resistance, there's a certain kind of narrative that really forms. And I'm sorry, I realize that that picture by slide format has been messed up a little bit by Blackboard, but hopefully you could still read that quotation. Just in case, I will read it out loud. So I draw my inspiration from Hannah Arendt, who in an essay she wrote in 1945, actually one of the first essays she wrote in English after immigrating to the United States, noted for the American public that those who emerged to wage war on the European continent fought against fascism and nothing else. And this is not surprising. What is surprising, precisely because of its strict, almost logical consequence, is rather that all of these movements at once found a positive political slogan, which plainly indicated the non-national, though very popular character of the new struggle. That slogan was simply Europe. And those capitalizations, the capitalization of Europe there in all caps is from the Arendtian original. In particular, I argue that this cohort sort of builds on the lessons of the past and uses memories of this past as a cognitive, motivational, and justificatory resource for integration. So just briefly, what I mean by that, in terms of a cognitive resource, I think that of this as, they use this as a way to think differently, right? To reshape their ideas, right? So this is sort of kind of in the head, the ideational labor. As a motivational resource, it was a way for them to kind of keep their eyes on the prize, to focus on issues that were really important after the war. And in the book, I describe a number of incidents over the course of European integration, where looking at leaders' diaries, you see them making really difficult political choices that are motivated by their memories. And then, perhaps most importantly, this past serves as a justificatory resource for integration. And this is a kind of public justificatory resource, so we can see it in the way that leaders talk in speeches, in electoral campaigns. We could see it in policy memos. We could see it in transcriptions from cabinet meetings and other kind of internal documents. So it's a way to sort of justify giving power over to institutions that lie outside the institutional architecture of the nation state. So the first generation of the founders is really defined by the three men I've put up on the slide here. I mean, obviously I could have added more, but most basically, I deal with Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, and Konrad Adenauer. And these are sort of, this is kind of the key constellation of leaders, I argue, that sort of push this forward. And I really tell the story in a lot of detail in the book. But basically my argument is that these individual leaders interpreted 1945 as a delegitimation of narrative, of nationalism, and sought solutions in Europe's pre-nationalist past. And in particular, for both Adenauer and Robert Schuman, kind of religion plays a really key role, and in particular, sort of this kind of political Catholicism, new movement of Christian democracy. Both of them, interestingly, during the war, spent time in internal exile, hiding in Catholic monasteries. And Robert Schuman famously talks about the European Union not as a new phenomenon, but as almost a return, right? So he famously once said that the Europe that we have founded is a return to perennial tradition, which a momentary aberration had succeeded in making us forget. And I think this is a really nice quotation because it really shows how Schuman is sort of reassembling the kind of fragmented past, right? The past that has been fragmented by this rupture in a new way. And in this new narrative, he's presenting nationalism as this kind of momentary aberration, right? So what had previously been the center of the dominant narrative, dominant political and even social narrative of Europe from the mid-19th century through probably 1945, so for 100 years, he now presents as a momentary aberration. He looks back to kind of earlier modes of relation between earlier modes of political rule, where nationalism hadn't been the dominant focus. And so this generation, right, by thinking in this way, they kind of lay the foundations for the European community, starting with the coal and steel community, and followed by the EEC and Euratom in the course of the 1950s. From there, I sort of, in the book, I tell a whole story about the stagnation of the EU in the 1960s and 70s, and where that comes from, which I'm happy to talk about further. I sort of argue that it's largely, that sort of period of stagnation is largely due to the very kind of singular figure of Charles de Gaulle, who sort of is very much a figure of the 19th century in terms of his political thinking. But after this period of stagnation, in the 1980s and 90s, a new generational cohort of leaders comes to power. And this is the generational cohort of leaders that were born in the 1920s and 30s. So they didn't experience the war as adults, they experienced the war as adolescents. And much of the literature on memory studies really emphasizes the fact that the period from about 15 to 30 is really crucial for the formation of formative memories, right? Of memories that really shape our identities and ourselves. And so this generation of 45ers, as they're sometimes called in the literature, was really shaped by World War II and by that experience. And in thinking about them, again, I focus on this kind of triad, this kind of constellation of Mitterrand, Delors, and Kohl, who sort of follow on from Schuman, Monnet, and Adenauer. And these individuals, right, these kind of builders, transformed the European community into the European Union completing the common market, opening intra-European borders, and then ultimately sort of laying the foundations for the euro and for sort of the common currency as well, which then comes in at the end of the 90s, early 2000s. And so I argue that sort of these two generations, the founders and the builders, that they sort of create what I call the classic narrative of integration. And this is sort of the idea that there's this kind of functionalist spillover based on the four freedoms. So that's kind of the economic, political, social side of the argument. But there's also this really important cultural side to this classic narrative of integration that we get sort of in its fullest form in the 1990s and early 2000s. And on the sort of cultural side of that narrative, the fight against fascism plays a really crucial role. So I highlight, I think sort of the best long statement of this kind of narrative is the Habermas Derrida text protesting the Iraq War that came out in 2003, both in Die Zeit and Le Monde. And sort of Habermas had recruited a bunch of other people, including Umberto Eco and other European intellectuals, to contribute to their national newspapers as well. And in that text, you really see this kind of idea of Europe as really being shaped by the overcoming of fascism and by the idea of never again. And perhaps the best sort of way to think about the cultural side of this narrative is building on Tony Jutt's conceptualization of the Holocaust as the European entry ticket. In that very famous conclusion he writes shortly before his death to his long narrative of post-war Europe, just called Post-War. And sort of in this narrative, it's really there is the cultural side, at least. The emphasis is not so much on the economic factors, but it's more, it roots integration, particularly as skepticism towards nationalism and the nation, and really in the overcoming of those ideas, and in sort of the idea of protecting essential rights, regardless of citizenship, regardless of nationality. The idea that what we have to prevent in post-war Europe is the kinds of abuses, the kinds of killings of the juridical person that enabled the Holocaust, and that in some sense is the first or primary role of the political community, right, to protect individuals within its borders. And I think sort of one of the best representations or carriers of this kind of classical narrative is summed up in the image that I've put on the right-hand side of the slide, which is the House of European History in Brussels, which I would encourage you all to go to. It's a very interesting, it tells a very interesting kind of narrative of Europe. And it really is a kind of institutionalization of this kind of classic narrative of integration in the same way sort of museums of national history in almost all European capitals are sort of mobilized to tell the story of the nation in a sort of positive light. So it's very interesting, that museum is a very interesting kind of artifact of a certain kind of way of thinking about European integration. So, sort of we see the culmination of that narrative in 2004 with the accession of the post-communist member states, which is sort of seen, right, as their return to Europe, which is seen as a kind of reunification of Europe, and sort of this kind of very victorious moment for the EU when everyone comes together. And what I argue is that it's precisely at that time, at the culmination of that narrative, it also becomes challenged in two fundamental ways. So the first challenge comes from the rise of what I call a skeptical generation that follows the kind of builders. If you look at the picture, you see Helmut Kohl and Gerhard Schröder. And I sort of use the transition, right, the handover of the German chancellorship of power in the Federal Republic from Kohl to Schröder as a kind of representation of the broader transfer of power from the kind of generation of the builders to this kind of more skeptical generation. Because what we see in Europe after the turn of the millennium is the first generation of leaders who are born after 1945, who thus have no personal experience, no memories of the Second World War, or of Europe's age of total war in general. And in contrast to previous generations, whose sort of defining formative experiences were ones of war, suffering, and atrocity, for this generation, their defining experience is the post-war economic miracle. And it's an economic miracle that really has occurred, at least seemingly, within the nation state. Right? So it's a much more economic way of thinking about the world, but it's also a much more nationalistic way of thinking about the world. Because even though European integration played an important role in the economic recovery of Europe after the war, that wasn't necessarily very visible to everyday citizens, right? The Wirtschaftswunder der Trente Glorieuses, these are seen as kind of national phenomena. And it's that kind of economic experience that defines the skeptical generation. And as a result of that, they tend to think in much more economistic ways, right? So they calculate their interest in Europe based on whether it's good for their economies, right? Whether it's good for them financially. And in that sense, for this generation, as Gerhard Schröder once said, the idea of being a good European is, quote, a matter of choice, not of obligation, unquote. And I think that that's a really sort of important transition, right? Where integration is no longer a kind of moral imperative. It's no longer about sort of protecting your citizens or sort of maintaining peace. It becomes simply about prosperity. And that's a major transition, because without that kind of moral normative foundation of peace, of protection, Europe becomes much more fragile and becomes much more difficult to sort of make difficult choices when all that is at stake is sort of prosperity. And sort of the decline of Europe is not part of a larger narrative. And just as an aside, I mean, since I live and work in the UK, it's quite interesting to, if you look at sort of a lot of cross-sectional polling data and voter data, it's notable that this kind of skeptical generation is also the generation where support for Brexit and for other sort of far-right nationalist or populist movements across Europe is concentrated. Right? So largely the support among those people is primarily from this kind of post-war baby boom generation, which I think is sort of no accident. It's sort of, I think that my kind of story of memory and generations can kind of help to explain the kind of rise of, or return of nationalism in a certain guise to Europe in recent years. So that's the first challenge, right, is this rise of the skeptical generation. The second challenge is the challenge of a different rupture. And this challenge emerges directly from the accession of the post-communist member states to the EU, starting in 2004, and then continuing since then, 2008, 2013. And in particular, what you see in the new member states from Central and Eastern Europe is that for these societies, the key rupture that defines sort of politics and everything else in them is not 1945. It's not the victory over fascism, but it's the fall of communism in 1989. Right? For these societies, for the vast majority of them, they did not experience 1945 as a liberation. They experienced 1945 as a renewed occupation. If you think about sort of army tanks on the streets of Prague, Budapest, etc., right, in the 50s and 60s, right, this is the kind of image, and it's the image of a renewed occupation, and it's kind of, it's a very, if that is the story, that leads to very different lessons for the present. And in particular, sort of, I argue that the rupture of 1989 challenges the classical narrative in really fundamental ways. It does so first because the sort of the resistance to communism. I mean, communism is an internationalist movement, right? That's the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and of the Soviet Union. And in resisting that narrative, resistance built on the idea of popular sovereignty, not the protection of rights, so this idea of the people unified, and actually nationalism, was a really crucial way of resisting the kind of internationalist movement of communism in much of Central and Eastern Europe, including places like Slovenia, which is where I'm from. So, and if it's no accident that nationalist writers writing in the vernacular were so important, were such important figures across a lot of Central and Eastern European states. So what you see here is a challenge to this classic narrative that emphasizes Europe as a way to overcome nationalism. Right? These states see the importance of culture, the importance of nationalism as really crucial elements of liberation and freedom. And as I talked about this in great depth in the lecture that I gave in the spring, so I don't want to go into too many details. I've also written a couple of shorter articles on this, but I argue that that this kind of rupture of 1989 is really what can really help us to understand and explain the rise of what has been termed illiberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. And this idea that these states are still see themselves as pro-European, but they understand what it means to be European in a very different way from the states of Western Europe, right? And they understand it through the lens of their experience of communism, not their experience of fascism. And in particular, right, this has led to a lot of problems because these states have also, in some sense, reacted very strongly against attempts by Western European states to enforce the kind of narrative of 1945, to enforce this kind of classical narrative with its emphasis on the Holocaust, on their own experience. And there has been a lot of tension in European memory politics ever since 2004, precisely in whether the experience of communism, the experience of fascism are equivalent, and what they should mean today, what kind of role they should play. You could see it in debates in the European Parliament about where, if we're going to ban the swastika Nazi symbols, then we need to also ban the hammer and sickle. So it comes out in all sorts of ways. And most notably, I think it comes out in the real resistance you see in a lot of Central European countries, Central and Eastern European countries, to the idea that they should give up sovereignty, that they should give up the decision-making power they fought so hard for during 45 years of communism to a kind of new federal entity, right? And you see the kind of narrative of Brussels as a new Moscow, which is really powerful in a lot of these states. So let me, in the last 5 to 10 minutes I have for my talk, give you a little bit of hope for the future. And returning to my generational argument, I think that the hope for the future is going to come from the next cohort. So I've been arguing that loss of memory through generational turnover and the challenge of this alternative rupture of 1989 has really undermined the normative foundations of Europe for the last 15 to 20 years. And there's been a lot of commentary and a lot of people complaining on the fact that Europe is simply muddling through recent crises, right? Both the financial crisis of 2008, which really hit Europe in 2010, and now more recently the Corona crisis. And I think that's true, but what I want to argue is that may be enough, and it may be better actually that the EU is muddling through now. Because right now, remember, the leaders, even of major Western European states, at least until recently, have been largely members of the skeptical generation, right? This generation that doesn't really see Europe as crucial, that doesn't have any emotional, affective connection to it. And what I want to argue is that before pushing further integration, it might be better to wait a little bit longer, to wait for the next generation, to wait for the generation of Europeans born in the 1970s and 80s to come to power. Because this, in some sense, is the first truly European generation. Right? This is the first generation that really grew up in the Europe that was created by the builders, right? The Europe of open borders, the Europe where they can study abroad in other European member states. And there, if you look at demographic data, Europeans who are most likely to live and work in a different member state than their home, most likely to be married, or have children with individuals from a different member state, most likely to be multilingual. And this kind of European generation is not a generation that is attracted to the EU because of its memories, but it's attracted to the EU because of its experiences. And I think the kind of best summation of the basic ideas that I want to put across here comes from Umberto Eco. So Umberto Eco, in a 2012 piece, he was talking about this generation, and he noted that this is, quote, the first generation of young Europeans. I call it a sexual revolution. A young Catalan man meets a Flemish girl. They fall in love, they get married, and they become European, as do their children, quote. And since I'm addressing a Belgian audience, I think it's important to point out, I mean, Umberto Eco, I think, is a very interesting thinker. It's interesting to note, look at the example he gives, Catalan and Flemish. So he picks two kind of national groups that don't have states. He picks kind of two of these sub-national groups, as they're called in literature, to highlight. But in doing that, he's almost highlighting the different role that nationality plays, the idea that the state is almost becoming, in some state nationalism, is becoming less important to this new European generation. That's really sort of a kind of an interesting aspect of this quotation. And the other thing, of course, he's highlighting more explicitly is that the pro-Europeanness of this cohort is not based on collective memory, but is based on their actual experiences in their lives. So, reasons for hope. So, I know Macron gets a lot of bad press, much of it for good reason, but I think that sort of he's an interesting figure because he's in many ways the first representative of this kind of European generation born in the 70s and 80s to come to power in a major European member state. And I think we can look at sort of his real push to, his attempts to push integration further through these kind of many European initiatives, almost as a kind of foreshadowing of what we might expect from this generation. Of course, there will be individual exceptions to that, but I think in that sense, he's a very interesting representative and a very interesting figure to think about. And it's interesting to think about if we might get the growing possibility that we will get more individuals like him sort of to come to power in the coming years. Now, that argument is based on a kind of generational logic, but there are real dangers. And in particular, there's a danger that what should be, in many ways, the most pro-European cohort, most pro-European generation in history, there's a real danger that they might turn against the EU. And this is a danger that is linked to the fact that recent crises, both the financial crisis and now more recently the corona crisis, have hit this generation particularly hard, right? This is a generation that whose formative experiences in many ways have been experiences of crisis. Right? They've kind of experienced the last 10 years, right, their 20s and 30s, when they should have been building careers, establishing themselves, establishing families, as a period of almost continual crisis. And that has the possibility to undermine the Europeanness of this generation if they kind of blame these developments on the EU, which is what a lot of sort of populist leaders would like them to do. So I'm giving reasons for hope, but this is not going to happen teleologically, right? There is a real danger here. And I think that sort of the EU has to be very aware of the dangers of alienating this generation of Europeans, especially sort of pro-Europeans should be wary of that. But there is reason for hope if the EU can survive long enough for this cohort to come to power. So the implication of that, very briefly, is that resolving the EU's ultimate aims and ambitions, right, its finalité, and pushing for further integration is better left to the future when there is a greater chance that pro-European solutions will kind of be available and on the table. And I've spoken for almost 40 minutes, and I've made all my major points. So I think I will just leave it at that for now. And well, thank you all for your attention, for being here. And I very much look forward to the response from Professor Herman Van Goethem.
Thank you. I hope you hear me. That's the first question. Secondly, do you see me?
On both counts.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to answer. I will have to look at the things I was writing while you were speaking. Very interesting indeed. I believe with you that the Second World War is over. The post-war Western world was built upon the memory of the Second World War, I agree, and as a result, the foundation of a new Europe was based on a shared belief in universal human rights. In my response, I would like to stress more upon the narrative of the human rights. Human rights treaties and so on, they serve to foster democracy in the after-war period. In the decades following 1945, we even articulated in Europe a belief in the universal human rights. A secularized, secular religion in which we strongly is our narrative, and as all believers in religion do, we believe in it. It is a new narrative in which indeed, as you say, the Holocaust acts in entry ticket because the Holocaust is in the heart of the discussion on human rights. You are stressing upon the fact of changing generations. I think my analysis would be a little bit different of the analysis of the generations, because the European leaders born after 1945, they still were in this narrative after in the 1980s, 1990s. The baby boom generation, which is my generation too, of course, I agree, we are very European, but now today I would like to make analysis on the young generation. They are born around, let us say, the millennials, about 2000 or even 1990. They lost even more the memory of the Second World War because they do not look back on the period between 1960 and 1980, which in Western Europe was characterized by stability, economic growth, optimism of progress. It was a world in which the Second World War was very much alive at school, on television, in the context of universal human rights. But take now the millennials. They were 7 years old when the banking crisis erupted in 2008. They have hardly ever known anything but political instability today. And it explains why I think in today destabilized Europe, I think they are much more important, I think, in the aspect of changing generations. I should stress more upon this generation. But I agree with you that continuity of history explodes indeed, very strongly in these generations. And what I would like to add to that, it is not a coincidence that as a result of today's political destabilization, old historical patterns are once again rearing their head, because destabilization is in fact about the systemic challenging of liberal democracy based on human rights, the one that fully took effect here after 1945, 1950, something like that. And if the foundation if the belief in human rights collapses, then the road is open to go back to Europe in the 1930s, in the period before the war. There I would like to give 4 examples which will demonstrate remarkable structural similarities with those years, the 30s. First of all, the phenomenon of the masses and the leader. We have a spectacular comeback of the masses as a political force. And this force operates independently from political parties and sometimes bashes into the old order like a guided missile. And these masses, they support a politician with great conviction leader, so to speak, with exaltation. And this conviction is emotional. The leader can say whatever he wants. It is not important as long as key message is related. And now we are rediscovering again this kind of leaders as we could see them in the 1920s and the 1930s. That's the first element. The second element you spoke about is of course nationalism. Nationalism, old nationalism, is coming back. Everything is history. Everything is history. And if the European identity based on human rights is brought down, what will replace it? A regional identity rooted in a distant past, encapsulated in a nationalism which has an issue with the other, with the foreigners, the migrants, the immigrants. And nationalism is very often linked with traditionalism too. And what we see now also, that in that retrograde movement, women are conservative nationalism nowadays, just as in the 1930s. And just as in the 1930s, when the Jews, in reality, an exceptionally diverse group, like the Muslims nowadays, who are being lumped together today. So the masses as political power, nationalism, and then also the power of the word, speaking, inflammatory language. Take the American president, for instance, who shamelessly and barely jokingly encourages shooting at Muslims and Mexicans. Such aggressive appeal to public opinion can develop collective violence, which might be probable too after the elections in the United States. So I think the power of the world is a third element which is coming back. And then the new media, of course. Now the force of the new media, just as in the 1930s, there first was the radio, which was completely new. It gave populist politicians a chance to infiltrate at the living rooms. In addition, the cinemas with the weekly news reels, which were very strong and which encouraged young people from all over Europe to join the fight in Spain with or against Franco. And just today, these new media have a convincing effect on their consumers. And so I think we also see, and you spoke about that when you had it about Eastern Europe, we see now indeed also revisionism regarding the Second World War. Because when the narrative of the Second World War starts to fade, you will encounter revisionism. This is logic. And I think this is not yet a problem in Western Europe, where the memory of the post-war period is still alive among those all around 25. So here again, I would like to stress upon the generation born in the 1990s, even after 2000. The older people, they still have the memory of the Second World War. This cannot be said of the Eastern Bloc, the former Eastern Bloc, where revisionism consequently spreading on a larger scale. Also generations born in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. Take Poland and Hungary and their official alternative facts concerning the analysis of the Holocaust as what you call the European entry ticket. Indeed, it is not a coincidence that precisely in these countries, revisionism on the Second World War is also revisionism on the Holocaust. Take in Hungary, what they are doing now with the role of Horthy, the dictator of the Second World War. The reason for this is that many of these countries weren't democracies in the decades till 1989. The generations that are now in power, they grew up in a totalitarian system without freedom of speech. They were not as the generations as we were in the 1970s, 80s. I presume you are rather young, but I grew up in the 1960s, 70s. This is in our generations, we will not find this kind of revisionism in history, but you will find it in Eastern Europe indeed. To conclude, I perfectly agree with your analysis, Peter. I would stress more upon the generation of the 1990s, 2000, I think, than you are doing. But yes, I agree. I agree in your analysis, and I agree too with your optimism with the analysis of the future challenges. And here too, I would even more stress upon the younger generation, the millennials, those born in the 1990s, because it is also the youngest generation who was just before Corona on the streets for climate change. And also these generations, I am convinced that they, even after, within this and 1 or 2 years after the Corona crisis, they will be there again, going on the streets, climate change, but also the struggle for global health into a new vision of the world, a new vision of Europe, which has to be elaborated. So I think these are the things I would like to bring in the discussion. And I would like really to thank you, Peter, for being here. As a rector, I have almost no time left to read. This is tragic, but one of the first books I will read during a holiday is your last book. Congratulations on it. And this is what I would like to bring in as in this discussion. Thank you. Okay, now.
Yeah, well, sadly, we don't have the means to make an applause. Maybe that would be with these Zoom things. We don't have that. Peter, do you want to respond to what the rector just said? Anything?
I mean, just very briefly. I mean, thank you very much for those very kind comments, and I hope that my book lives up to the billing, and that you find it good holiday reading. There's always a story that was told to me. There's a story that was told to me by my advisor, who said that sort of the quality of what you read over the course of your lifetime goes down, right? Because you start at university as an undergraduate reading the great works, right, of human civilization, and you go to graduate school, you read the great works of your field, and then you become sort of an assistant professor and you read student essays, and then you become a professor and head of department and you read administrative memos. Sort of the quality just goes down. So hopefully this will be a little bit of a break. Substantively, I think this is really interesting. I think you're absolutely right about the return of sort of the masses, and the return of the phenomenon of kind of this of isolation, and of these kind of, you know, aggregates of individuals who aren't really connected with each other and yet form these kind of mass movements, right? Even despite the splintering that's brought about by new media, by new technology, etc. I mean, I think in some sense, it is precisely some of those phenomena of the mass, right, and of the power of the mass that has led to so many comparisons of our present to the Weimar era, right? So in addition to the political programs themselves, this kind of phenomenon of the mass as kind of a solution to kind of feeling of isolation and meaninglessness or loss of meaning is particularly important. I think that it is interesting that sort of, yes, the emotional appeal, and particularly sort of the rise that we see again of kind of this idea of the great man, right? It almost always is a man, as a return to this kind of politics, and particularly a return to this kind of interwar politics of victory and defeat, as opposed to, I think, much of the post-war era, which was a politics defined by compromise and coalition, right? Where leaders would win elections, but it wasn't actually the outcome of elections, it was turnout that was important, and you always cooperated, and you had to negotiate within coalitions, but also among societal interests, trade groups, etc. And what we're seeing now is this kind of return of this kind of interwar politics of victory and defeat, right? I think it's pretty obvious in Brexit, right? You win a narrow vote, you win a narrow referendum, and you don't compromise at all. You go full force, right? Or even kind of Donald Trump's statement that he made in accepting the Republican Party's nomination for the presidency just recently. But he did it on the steps of the White House in violation of the Hatch Act, which sort of prohibits the use of sort of Parliament and the White House and kind of these public spaces for politics. He stands there and he says, you know, this is all about the fact that we're here and they're not. Like this kind of victory and defeat. It seems almost existential. And I think that's a real change in terms of the politics that we have now as well. And then in terms of this kind of even younger generation, the generation of the millennials, I think you're absolutely right that it'll be interesting to see what this generation is like, right? These are probably the generation of our students now, largely. It'll be interesting to see how they are and what their views to Europe will be over time. I think it's probably still a little bit too early to say much definitive on that point. I think you're right that there's optimism in the sense of their mobilization for issues like climate change. However, I think sort of what'll be particularly interesting to watch is sort of the way that this generation, as they become older and start to become more active in politics and take on leadership roles in society, will be to see what their views of capitalism will be like, right? And especially given their experiences, their really formative experiences of the financial crisis, and whether that kind of skepticism of capitalism, of finance, will actually lead to fundamental changes. And for me, the key question there will be both looking at sort of the issue of climate change and the issue of sort of the future of capitalism, which obviously are very connected in and of themselves. I think the key issue for us thinking about European values is whether this future generation, whether this generation of younger millennials, will see Europe as a way, as a tool to address those issues, right? Whether they will see Europe as a kind of a collective, a bigger platform from which they can shape global capitalism in a way to make it more climate friendly, and whether sort of they will really sort of see Europe as a key to sort of achieving the political goals that they have as a result of these kind of formative experiences, this kind of very unstable childhood or unstable politics that has surrounded their childhood. I think that certainly is something that we will have to watch going forward. So thank you very much again for these really wonderful, thought-provoking comments.
Thanks, Peter. I've turned on the light in my COVID dungeon in the meantime. I hope it's too disturbing. I want to invite everyone to ask your questions. You can post them in the chat box that you find on the right-hand side. Yes, it's on the right hand. So you can type your question in there, and we will collect some questions for both Peter and Herman. Herman, are you raising your hand? Yeah, maybe I can start with a short remark while we're waiting for people to post their questions for you. I was struck by your. It's actually a kind of intergenerational discussion as well. I think someone has their mic on. I should turn it off. I don't know who it is. But it's also an intergenerational discussion. I was struck by your optimism, Peter, as opposed to Herman's. Well, comparisons to the 1930s are not very optimistic in that sense, and I kind of had a little bit of, and then it went down again. But I was also, because you were saying this generation of Macron, the younger generation, but some of the leaders of the far right are also in this younger generation in a way. So I mean, there's this division, and then what you're also seeing is this kind of coalition forming across Europe, from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. The people like Geert Wilders in Holland, who's talking to Orban, talking to people in Poland on the far right, etc., and forming a kind of pan-European far right. So this is also something that is not a reason for too much hope. And then my second remark was the note on class differences, and because you were really emphasizing the benefit that people have from being able to travel across borders, and Umberto Eco's example, that was indeed really funny how he talks about the regions. But there's also perhaps a big group of people that can't benefit from all of these aspects of the EU, and therefore they might have very different ideas. So these are just a couple of thoughts that I had while listening to you, which you might address while we're waiting for people. Please don't be afraid. Any question is a good question. Just post it on the chat or send it via email, and we will collect it. We're trying not to work with the raising of hands. Please say it in your in the chat box. So there's this little lilac box. You push that button, and then you have a chat function where you can post your question. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think both of those are good points. I mean, right? I mean, no generations aren't homogenous. So certainly, right? I mean, the far right has become attractive to certain younger generations, and in particular, I think that I haven't seen any data that sort of young people are supporting any of these kind of far right movements in large numbers, but they certainly do have reason to be disaffected, right? In precisely the sense because of some of the issues that Professor Van Goethem has been pointing to, right? The experiences of crisis, the fact that youth unemployment has been so high, etc. So I think there is a danger that this kind of generation that should in many ways be the most pro-European will end up kind of losing that orientation due to these kind of other factors. So I think that's certainly something that European politicians or that leaders in the present need to be very aware of and very wary of. And it's interesting to me, I mean, the issue of class differences, on one level, I completely agree, right? I mean, obviously, people of a certain sort of kind of middle to upper class background who are able to afford to go abroad on vacation, or who are able to go to university, who have those kind of more cosmopolitan experiences that benefit more, right? This is sort of the famous idea of kind of upper class or middle class anywheres versus kind of the lower class somewheres, right? The people who are really tied to communities, to really specific local communities. What I found really interesting is, I mean, Sheffield, where I teach, is a very working class city, right? One of these post-industrial kind of areas that really suffered through the 1980s and 90s. And it's been so interesting to me traveling or even going through the airport that a lot of, I mean, even a lot of lower class British people, right? They can't imagine their summer vacation without the trip to Spain, right? Without the trip to Ibiza, right? And it seems like, I mean, at least travel within Europe is something that is, I mean, this may be less true for some Central and Eastern Europeans because of sort of the lower salaries. But at least in sort of more prosperous member states, I think freedom of travel is something that people even from lower classes value. And you see that generational divide. I mean, at least in terms of sort of, I've been doing a lot of work recently, a lot of thinking and working on Brexit and the generational issues there. And you really, there's not that much of a class difference. It's primarily an age difference. I mean, education is in some sense a factor, but even sort of lower class British people, you know, under the age of 45 or 50, really see Europe as part of their destiny as sort of this kind of vacation spot and identify with Europe in a way that I actually was quite surprised by. So I think class is important, but it's something that I would obviously like to think about further. But I think there are reasons to think that it might not be quite quite such a factor, but it's definitely something that I will keep thinking about. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I have not seen any questions. That was what I was saying. Yeah, unless anybody has sent anything via email. Marina, you're raising
if I may interfere, we might try to grant the word to people.
Okay.
So I see Marina now raising her hand. I'll try to give her the microphone by changing her status. So Marina, now you should be able to ask a question. Go on.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Okay,
we hear you.
I think first of all, the chat function is not operational for the moment. I've just sent you an email, so maybe that's a problem for everybody. And then secondly, I have not, let's say, been able to attain the whole webinar, but having experience for over 30 years within multinationals isn't the problem, let's say, rather an economical problem, a problem we've also seen, let's say, in the early 20s and 1930s. And the fact that that is the basis for the current, let's say, upcoming fascism, whatever, let's say, we see in the whole of Europe, that people are sensing the fact that the whole, let's say, the whole atmosphere in Europe is changing, and that currently, let's say, what Europe represents, the flag is not covering the cargo. What I mean by that is that I think one of the biggest mistakes in, let's say, setting up Europe is the fact that they've introduced the euro, but that beneath that we are far away from creating a social Europe, and that is, I think, the main problem. And being that at the basis of everything we see coming up in Europe now. If you talk to people, let's say, that are over 90, that have experienced the whole, let's say, atmosphere around World War II, they'll tell you exactly the same thing.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. So, I mean, yeah, the economic issues I think are important, and sort of in the sort of ever-growing literature that's trying to really understand what's happening today. There is this kind of fundamental divide, right, between those people who want to argue that it's economic factors that are key, and those who argue that it's these kind of cultural factors of identity, and of this kind of return of nationalism that is key to explaining what's happening today. My own view of this is that economics is important, and it sort of helps to set the table, but that ultimately it is these issues of culture that is important, that are sort of driving the phenomenon we're seeing today. And in large part, I think that sort of we see this in the fact that a lot of kind of these Eurosceptical movements today, their appeals are primarily to identity. And again, I mean, you know, if you think about, I mean, Brexit, I think, has been the most successful Eurosceptical movement that we've witnessed up to this point. And that movement was very much, right, it was not at all about economics. The people who cared about economic pocketbook issues voted Remain. Right, the Leave campaign, and if you look at exit polling and sort of why people voted to leave, it was primarily because of issues of identity, right? This idea of that their Englishness, in particular Englishness, not Britishness, but that Englishness was under threat. And this was primarily something that was in England, right? It was not a feeling that was broadly shared in Scotland. It was not a feeling that was broadly shared in Northern Ireland. And it's these kind of cultural issues, even the idea, right, of taking back control. Right? I mean, a lot of Brexiteers will talk about sort of, right, the economic benefits of becoming Singapore on Thames or something like that. But there's not actually a lot of people believe that, but they believe that the economic sacrifice is worth sort of the benefits that they'll get from sort of taking back control from sort of defending kind of English identity. And so I think that that these kind of really cultural issues are very important. Now it's possible if there had been broad-based prosperity and the kind of growth that we saw sort of in the post-war era, in the initial 30 years after the war, right, from 45 to 75, these issues wouldn't be coming up to the same extent. But I think there still would be a lot of disaffected people in England who would be angry to see sort of, Eastern Europeans, and in particular, right, the paradigmatic example is the Poles taking over their town, who would sort of feel threatened by that. So I think that's primarily, I think it is, issues of culture are quite important. In terms of the lack of social Europe, I mean, I think you're right to point to that as part of the problem, right? I mean, there is, right, the EU's functional constitution, right, its basic foundational treaties and its constitutional order at the present is really shaped by sort of a kind of economic neoliberalism and economic fundamentalism, right? This sort of constitutional order really is based on, right, this kind of four freedoms of goods, services, labor, and capital, right? It's not a social Europe. I think that is going to be a problem for the EU going forward. But I think, this is also broadly attributable, right? I mean, that's a political problem. It's a problem that's rooted in the politics of the European continent. And I think that's sort of the center right in the 80s and 90s, right, when they controlled the Christian democratic parties by and large, the exception of like Mitterrand, when they, in France, when they controlled a plurality or a majority of the member states in that period, they really took advantage of that to sort of push their policy priorities on free markets and the economy. Whereas in the late 90s, when I think 13 of 15 of the member states were led by social democratic parties, those parties really failed to mobilize or to Europeanize their kind of agendas to create a sort of social protection system at the European level. And I think that was a big failure of the left. So I think, yeah, there is definitely a political factor to this. And I think that the left has in some sense been too reliant on welfare protections at the nation state level. It's possible that's now going to start to change, largely not so much as a result of the financial crisis, but because of Corona. Right? If you think about sort of the mutualization of debt and worker protections, right? I mean, there are some movements, or some people have started to think about pushing into this direction as well. But that's going to be obviously a political struggle, and we'll see how it turns out.
Thanks, Marina, for your question. Thanks, Peter, for your answer. Professor Van Goethem, did you also want to say anything to Marina's question? In the meantime, if you want to raise a question, the chat function should be working right now. But we could also work with raising hands if that's what you prefer. So please send us your questions. Okay. Professor Van Goethem has issues with his microphone and would like to give the opportunity to the audience. We will give it a couple of more minutes for you to think through everything that has been said and think about possible questions you might have. You can post them in the chat or raise your hand. think we can only conclude that this was an exceptionally clear talk and that everybody agrees with what you said, Peter, and what you said, Professor Van Goethem. I think
maybe I can still raise a question.
Yes, of course. Then
yes, because last week we had a talk about migration and the new migration pact. So my question to Peter Verovšek would be, if you talk about Europe, experience of Europe as a Europe of open borders, which is the experience of the younger Europeans, the young Catalans marrying the young Flemish girls. So in migration policy, we see the opposite at work, closing borders. So how do you see that migration pact actually in this construction of the Europe of the open borders?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real, the real irony of Europe and migration policy, right, is this kind of opening of internal borders and yet sort of fortification of external borders. And I mean, I obviously find that hugely problematic. And I mean, if you want to tackle it from just the economic side, right, you look at sort of the demographic aging of Europe. But I think that also sort of it's been really interesting to me to think about the strengthening of extra-European borders or Europe's external borders over the last 10 years, right, as a result of the rise of populism. And then to compare that to the kind of European uptake or sort of the European participation in these kind of Black Lives Matter protests in the spring. And it will be interesting to see if the younger generation sort of desire to sort of think more critically about Europe's complicity in colonialism, whether that will sort of generate an alternative political push towards perhaps a defortification of those external borders, and perhaps towards sort of allowing more migration as almost a form of reparation, or a sort of way of sort of making up for, atoning for the kind of colonial legacy that I think there has been greater awareness of more recently. So I think that sort of it'll be really interesting to see. There is a certain irony to sort of, Europe's claims to be this kind of great humanitarian organization and its claims to be opening up borders and its actual opening up of its internal borders as compared to sort of this other dynamic of the external borders. I mean, and we'll see. I mean, obviously sort of migration, even intra-European migration now in Corona times has become more of an adventure than it used to be. But I don't take internal border closures of the Corona times very seriously. I was actually in Germany doing some research in March and had to return home to Slovenia by car. And both the German-Austrian border and the Austrian-Slovenian border were officially closed. But when I drove through them, there wasn't a single barricade, there wasn't a single policeman. So I just kept driving through two formally closed borders. I think that's, I think sort of there may be some internal spot checks and all these kind of things, but I don't think that European states have the money or even in many ways the capacity anymore to actually patrol their own internal borders. I think that's really been lost. I don't think that that's coming back. So I think that, so maybe that's a good thing. And maybe sort of, despite the fact that there may be good reasons to sort of close some borders now due to the virus, I'm not too worried about that aspect.
Thanks, Peter. And I see that Marina has sent in a comment saying that EU politicians and local representatives had about 30 to 40 years to create a social Europe, which they didn't do. and leaving the further harmonization to future generations may be too late. Action is required now to counter the threat of utmost left or right-wing parties. Otherwise, divide and conquer will prevail. There are many opportunities, but much will depend upon how people are informed. Keep the explanation simple. Migration is a social, climate, and political problem, and walls will not change this. Okay, let me first say goodbye to Herman Van Goethem, Professor Van Goethem. He has another meeting at 7:30 and wishes you all the best, Peter, and says goodbye. And in the meantime, we have a question from Aveline. As a 90s kid, so a millennial, Aveline is a millennial, I feel that there's an increasing polarization between people of my generation. On the one hand, the people who see the benefits of multiculturalism, and on the other hand, the ones who support the far right. How does your generational model explain that difference?
Yeah, so I'm going to thank Professor Van Goethem again, even though I see he's already left. So let me see if I can tackle these two questions briefly. So let's see, to Aveline's point first. Yeah, I mean, I think sort of, as I think I mentioned in my talk and in my reply to Professor Van Goethem, I think sort of my argument about sort of the younger generation, right? It's based on a certain kind of generational logic. But I think there is this danger, right? Precisely because of the financial crisis, precisely because because sort of young generation has in many ways suffered the most from the financial crisis, but now also under Corona, that there is a chance that sort of this kind of disaffection will spread, right? So I don't want my argument to seem like a kind of almost Marxist historical determinism. It certainly is not meant to be that, and I think that complacency on this front is quite dangerous. So we'll see. I mean, what I do think is quite interesting is, and again, I think I mentioned this in my reply to Professor Van Goethem, is precisely the fact that sort of even this kind of, among the younger generation, and I certainly see this among my students, there seems to be, whether there's a right wing or a left wing reaction, there does seem to be this skepticism towards sort of free markets and capitalism. And so it'll be really interesting to see where that goes moving forward. But yeah, I mean, I agree, there is a danger of disaffection. And right, I mean, especially this kind of younger generation of the, sort of, I guess your generation, like the 90s, to a certain extent, it's my generation too, but especially to the younger generation, right, the students now, there is a real danger there, and there is a danger of disaffection, and I think that's something that we do have to be aware of. To Marina, I mean, I agree that action is required now. I'm not sure how, given my argument, I'm not sure how realistic that is. But I also think that sort of, it's important often to remember how young Europe is. I mean, the EU in general, right? If you look at sort of the literature on state formation, and especially sort of literature on citizenship and the development of rights, right, from economic rights to political rights to social rights. So, going back to even classical texts like T.H. Marshall, usually rights come in that order, right? Economic rights, so property, right, these kind of rights protections, then political rights, voting, and then social rights are usually the last rights to come along, right? Social protections. And the EU, I mean, if you date it, right, to 1952 and the creation of the coal and steel community, even then, it's a relatively young community. And the European coal and steel community really wasn't very much, right? I mean, if you have a more realistic dating of when Europe really began to take on, sort of, really began to affect the lives of individual Europeans and not just sort of companies and trade, you'd have to go even into the 80s. So I think it's important to remember that sort of social rights take time. And they've never been achieved quickly. So I do hope that I think there is reason to hope that sort of action will come in the near future. But again, right, I mean, this is where it's going to need political uptake, and it's going to need leaders and sort of populations to vote for leaders who will be willing to will have the motivations and who will be willing to make sacrifices to achieve those kinds of ends. Now, I think there is reason to hope in the sense that left-wing parties have kind of abandoned or become skeptical of this kind of third way, which I think explains, third way leftist embrace of neoliberalism. I think that, in addition to the cultural issues, economic issues are back on the agenda for the left. And I hope that sort of some of that political capital is ultimately spent in the sort of this push towards a more social Europe. And in particular, I think I could say that one of the best pieces I've read recently on this is Colin Crouch recently put out a kind of manifesto on social Europe on the website Social Europe. And so he does a really nice job, I think, of laying out what needs to happen sort of at the European level. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested in, or encourage you and anyone else who's interested in the issues of social Europe to find that sort of short text and to read it. It's, I think, quite informative.
Okay, thanks. We're edging towards 7:30. We've been here for an hour and a half, and I think it's time to call it a day and to have a break for us. I would like to also invite all of you to the next sessions that we'll be having. We'll be having Cynthia Miller-Idris soon in November, she's just published a book about the far right. It's called it's on the Homeland. I don't really remember. I'm having a bit of trouble with my brain, I think. In any case, you'll be talking about the far right, and I think it'll be very interesting also to hear her, since we'll be having the American elections on the 3rd of November, and she's speaking to us on the 21st. So we will be able to talk about the implications of that and the rise of the far right also in the US and the relationships with the European Union. Then after that, we're having Akugo Emejulu, who's going to talk about Afro-European women and grassroots organizing among Afro-European women, and how what that has to do with European values. So that's going to be very interesting as well. And our last lecture in December is by Nuno Ferreira, who will be talking about something that Peter also just mentioned, this image that the EU likes to create of itself as a humanitarian, where people are welcome. Yeah. So the book by Cynthia Miller-Idris is called Hate in the Homeland. So I was right on the Homeland, not very right on hate. I was confused with Blood in the Homeland and Hate in the Homeland. It's called Hate in the Homeland. I can recommend it. It's a great book. So I was going to talk about the last lecture, Nuno Ferreira, on LGBTI refugees. So it combines kind of the image of Europe as humanitarian and the image of Europe as very free when it comes to sexual orientation, which is also, it seems, when you look at the experiences of LGBTI refugees, doesn't really live up to its name. So that is what we'll be discussing in December. You can find all the information about all the lectures on the website of UXIA, where you can also register. So I hope to welcome you then again. And I want to thank Peter for his super interesting lecture today. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's been a real honor to be part of this this lecture series, which with such other prominent and excellent speakers. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and for listening. And if you have further questions or comments, it's very easy to find my email. Feel free to shoot me a message.